My name's Katrina, and I've recovered from compulsive eating. So I'm going to be talking about what my life was like before I came into CCEA, what happened, and what it's like now. So immediately before coming into CCEA, I was desperate, absolutely desperate. Even though I had been working in another 12-step food program, my mind was completely out of control, was constantly telling me that I was rubbish, I was no good, I was stupid, everything I did was wrong. Basically, that I was a big mistake. Chronic worrying about everyone and everything. And I was still seeking food to make me feel better. Even though I was in another program, I'd get a few weeks of what I thought of as abstinence and then relapse. I'd have that first bite, it would seem to help, it was delicious, I felt better, but of course then I couldn't stop and I would numb myself out and then be watching Netflix and social media. Then my life is very different now. So I'll take you back to my early life. As a child, I always felt like a misfit. I wasn't good enough, I wasn't what my parents wanted. I mean, in that regard, they had the boy first, then I was the girl. But as I grew as a child, I clearly wasn't the kind of girl that my mom wanted. She wanted a girly girl that she could dress up and all that kind of stuff. And I just wasn't that little girl. We lived in a village and I loved being outdoors, very active, climbing trees, playing on roller skates and so on. That side of my life was really good. And at that very young age, I don't remember much about food. But when I was about 8, we moved to the town, which was a huge loss. I didn't have the countryside to play in and explore, and I lost friendships. We'd had a lovely community in the village where our family knew all the other families, and we'd get together and kids all played together, and I lost all that. And I was deeply sad. I can remember crying every night. And then I remember one day finding a coin on the pavement, a big British penny. This was back in the 60s. And I could go and buy a little packet of sweets for that penny. And it felt like life changed. And I spent a lot of time looking for money. And if ever I found it, that was it. I was off to the local sweet shop. I remember I had a money box that I put my weekly pocket money into. And it was a lovely box. I probably got it as a present. It had pictures on it and 5 slots to put your money in, and they each had a label. One was for sweets, one was for comics, magazines, one was for holidays, and so on. And every Saturday I'd be given my pocket money. I'd spread it out between those 5 slots, and then by Saturday lunchtime, I'd taken it all out and spent it on sweets. We have a charity here called Dr. Bernardo's, which was a children's charity, and school children were given a box that looked like a little house. It was very cute, and you put your pennies in, and at the end of the year, you took this box to the local cinema and you got to see a film. And I'd be putting my pennies in, and then I couldn't get them out because it was sealed underneath, but I'd be tipping it upside down and using a knife, desperately trying to get these pennies out so that I could go and buy more sweets. I used to sneak fudge and sweets out of the cupboard in the kitchen. I remember as a family, we'd be washing up, clearing away after a meal, and I'd be trying to be silently behind the door of the cupboard where the box of sweets was, trying to silently open the lid and get one sweet out. Food in the family was fairly restricted, but then there were these occasions where my mum would make pancakes or waffles, and we could have as many as we wanted, loading them up with sugar and cream and all the rest of it. And I remember those as being a highlight of the week. So apart from that food, I was just always out of control emotionally. It took very little to set me off into a big upset. I mean, the slightest thing anybody would say, and I would be in tears. I remember telling myself to not be such a crybaby and that I should try and get through a day without crying, and I couldn't do it. Something would happen that I would burst into tears, and I would just give myself a really hard time about it. As a teenager, things got worse. The whole kind of women and body image thing came in. My mum was she was very petite. She had a beautiful figure, and I can remember her telling me that you have to have a flat tummy. You just, as a girl, as a young woman, you have to have a flat stomach. So you need to strengthen your tummy muscles by holding your tummy in, and eventually you'll have these strong muscles and your stomach will be flat all the time. So I was 13, and I remember going around for a day pulling my stomach in. And at the end of the day, going to her and asking her how long I have to do this for. So I was 13. She said, oh, till you're about 18. So I was supposed to spend 5 years going around, with my stomach pulled in. And I can remember kind of thinking, oh, is that what it means? Is that what you have to do to be a woman in this world? Because if you do, then I don't want it. And that message, well, it was confusing, added to the message that I'm not good enough. And I remember restricting my food on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays so that my tummy would be flat for the disco that me and my friends went to on a Saturday night. And I can remember kind of sexual harassment and abuse from teenage boys and young men. I can remember dressing up, trying to look the part, trying to be, this right kind of female, thinking I looked nice, going out to the disco or the pub, and some guy reaches out and, pinches my backside or touches my breast. And again, that horrible feeling of, okay, so that's what it means to be female. If you dress up and you do all this stuff and look the part, then you're making yourself vulnerable. Really, really confusing. I didn't really have boyfriends, not surprisingly. The ones I did were very short relationships. I think I was very needy, kind of waiting for that next phone call or asking them if they loved me or liked me and all that kind of stuff. So I was terrified to be in the world, to be on my own. I remember at the end of school, kind of 16, 17, and you're applying to go to college, university, and just thinking that I really thought I couldn't do anything. And so I got married to a man who looked like he adored me. He was a good man, he was a good friend, but I had no physical desire for him. I was completely terrified of sex. I just thought he was a safe bet. I say I thought. I don't think I thought about it at all. It was all just on automatic. I had no way of listening to the higher power voice. Looking back on it, that voice was actually really loud in my head saying, don't do this, don't marry. This is not the right person. But I couldn't hear that voice because I was so scared of what it meant to be on my own. So I got married straight after university. So I went from home to university where I lived in halls of residence, so very sheltered. And then I got married in the summer after university finished. So I had no time living on my own at all. I couldn't even think about living on my own. So the only way that I could see at that time was to get married. This was at the end of the 1970s. So not surprisingly, I had 10 years of miserable marriage. That was just awful. And the food stuff kind of kicked in quite a lot then. I can remember the two of us buying food together, preparing a healthy meal. And then I've bought a dessert that's got, 4 portions. We have a portion each. And I say, let's put the other rest in the fridge and we'll have it tomorrow. Well, I'm sure you know how that goes. I ate both the extra portions before the night was up, and I told my husband, don't let me eat the cheesecake. Of course, when he tries to stop me eating it, I'm going to kill him. You know, I'm not. There's no way he can stop me eating it, which was really confusing to him and as well as to me. At that time, I was teaching in school, and that kept me busy. And I was very compulsive around the planning. The perfectionism meant that I was working all evening, sometimes all night, to perfect my lesson plans, never believing that they were good enough. And food didn't feel like a particularly big issue. I kind of ate a constant supply of sugar, so it didn't look like a binge. But I had like tea and coffee through the day with a couple of spoonfuls of sugar in, and puddings after meal. So I was at that point, I was reasonably healthy. And I think the compulsiveness about the teaching kept me away from actually binging. I was working all evening rather than eating all evening, which changed later. I was extremely unhappy. I had all kinds of therapy and counseling, some of which helped a little, but mostly was directly contradictory to what I now know. The therapists would say that you have the power. It's just a decision to eat healthily, or it's just a decision not to overwork, or it's just a decision to leave your husband. All these things that they needed to be able to do, but had absolutely no power to do. So I had my son when I was 28, and then the misery just multiplied 1,000%. He was very easy as a baby, physically, practically looking after him. I didn't find that difficult at all, but I could not look after myself. I could not think about resting when he was asleep, or asking my husband for help, or, setting any kind of boundaries. It was just awful. And then I started eating more. I was so lonely. I was completely incapable still of making friends, partly because no one was good enough. I was so judgmental about everyone, and I was in control all the time. I can remember my son, he was a baby at some point, he didn't sleep very well, but I can definitely remember giving advice to other parents on how to make their babies sleep. And I kind of looking back, I think, what was I doing? I'd been up half the night, and yet somehow I thought I was qualified to tell them what they needed to be doing. When I was about 30, I did get some good counseling, which helped me leave my husband, which was a really big deal because, as I said earlier, I was so scared of living on my own. I did leave. I did set up home on my own. My son, me and my husband co-parented pretty well between us. Well, we lived fairly close, and my son came and went, we kind of spent half and half the week, with each of us, which is not ideal, but for separated parents, it wasn't bad. And I carried on teaching, and I kind of knew I had a problem with the food, but as I said before, the compulsiveness about teaching did keep me away from food to some extent, or keep me away from the worst of the binges. At some point then I did hear about sugar being an addiction, and I thought, well, I've certainly got that, and I would give it up for quite long periods. I wasn't dieting. But my problem was in my inability to regulate my emotions, my way of judging, usually silently, other people who dared to do things differently to me or have different opinions. So I had a huge lack of friendships. I was so shy and awkward with people, so awkward, that I would prefer to be by myself and just avoid those feelings. I was angry with everyone, angry with the whole world, permanently anxious. and struggled to stick at anything. I would start a new hobby and then decide I was no good at it and give it up. I always felt dreadful about my teaching, the desire for perfectionism in my job. Okay, yeah, it still kept me away from the food to some extent. Until I retired from work, and then, oh my goodness, the food really took off. I retired early because the anxiety around my teaching was too much. I left as soon as I could. And now, of course, I had unstructured time. And so now I was binge eating and watching those, those programs where you get like 20 episodes. You have 20 seasons of something with 20 episodes in each, so you can be lost for days. And that was what I did for weeks on end, and my weight just ballooned. And every day I'm making a new decision. Today I won't eat sugar. Today I'll only eat if I'm with a friend. I'll only eat sugar at weekends, and so on. But in a very short time, I was lost again. I remember that weird feeling when my brain is saying, I'm not going to eat this chocolate, while my hand and arm is literally putting it in my mouth. And I can remember being really confused, like, how come I don't have this decision-making ability? I really want to be able to do this or not to do this. How is this happening? And I remember being really puzzled by friends who could lose weight easily and not put it back on. A friend and I remember talking, we had the same problem. We'd talk about, if I get a packet of biscuits, I have to eat the whole packet. She went off for some counseling. I think it lasted she went once a week for 6 months, and she stopped overeating. I've known her 20 years later, she puts on a few pounds occasionally and she adjusts her portion sizes and loses the weight. And another friend who came with me to one of the kind of pay and weigh systems. And again, she lost a few pounds she needed to lose. And I was just completely baffled by people who could do that, which of course just kept adding to that feeling of what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? So then I started on all those programs for losing weight. Those internet programs where you pay £100 and they send you 12 weeks of recipes with guaranteed weight loss. I found someone who advertised a weight loss program who lived around the corner. She weighed me. I thought, well, this is bound to help, isn't it? She's going to weigh me. She's going to see I'm going to be accountable to her. She's going to set me up with food plans. And I can remember her being quite baffled when I went back week after week, and I just couldn't in any way stick to the plan that she had given me. I tried homeopathy, I tried Chinese medicine, I tried that system where you're tapping parts of your body and saying things, and none of it worked. And then a friend suggested another food program, and I went to a face-to-face meeting, and it was such a relief. Oh my goodness, I cried through the whole meeting. Here were other people like me, people who were telling their stories of being completely out of control around food. And I read literature, started with my first sponsor. Looking back on it, it seems like maybe people didn't have that much recovery. They didn't seem to be very happy, which was quite confusing. And I started out on food plans, working out my trigger foods, counting my days of abstinence. And I did find the big book hard to read. I found the gendered language and the word God hard. I was really resistant to it. I did persevere because at that point I couldn't see, I didn't know of any other option. And where in the big book it says, this is in the doctor's opinion, it says, the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. And I took that, it was a relief to hear it. I took it to mean that I was allergic to certain food ingredients and I should cut them out of my diet completely. I love having rules. So I loved making my lists of my red foods and my green foods. And it worked to some extent. I could cut out sugar and flour for a few weeks, lose a few pounds, feel a bit better about myself. But the scales and the so-called abstinent days became my higher power. That was how I measured my worth. Have I been abstinent today? It was the only question that really mattered. And life did start to get a bit better, but I still hadn't made a good connection with a higher power. My weight was still my higher power, how many days of abstinence and so on. And I was just in a cycle of food plans and then relapsing. And my diary back then, it's really sad looking back at it. It's littered with, it says day 1, meaning I'm starting again, day 1 of abstinence, day 2, day 3. And it gets up to maybe day 17. And then there's nothing for a few days. And it means I've relapsed, and I haven't wanted to write that in my diary. So there's nothing there. Then after a few days or a week, it says day 1, day 2 again. And what happened then was that sponsors wouldn't carry on working with me. They wanted me to, I had to be able to stay abstinent to be able to work with the sponsor. So I would have to start again with a new sponsor. I have no idea. I think I might have got through 20 sponsors. It was so demoralizing. And again, it kicked in with all that, what's wrong with me? Why is it that I can't do this? And this time it will be different. I'll have a new sponsor and it will be different. And I would decide that I'd keep changing something. I'd decide that different foods were my trigger. Maybe I would add fruit to the trigger food list, or dried fruit, or salty snacks. Or I'd add, okay, this time I need to send photographs of my food to my sponsor. My food plan every morning. 100 ways of trying to make myself accountable, and all very much on my own power. I really hadn't got this idea of a higher power at all. It's got to be me that's got to make this decision. And one of the awful things looking back on that period was I never got through all the steps, because I'd be halfway through and I'd relapse and I'd have to get a new sponsor and they would want me to start again. So I never got, I'm so grateful now that I work through the steps quite quickly and I see the recovery that happens in steps 10, 11 and 12. I just didn't get that at all back then. So then what happened was I needed to find another sponsor. And I picked someone fairly at random from the sponsor WhatsApp group. And I laid out my requirements. And it's quite funny looking back. I was so sure I knew exactly what I wanted. I needed daily phone calls, a food plan, an action plan, sending photos of my food. I mean, I was desperate. Like, if I do this and this and this and this, and I'm accountable to you, maybe that's going to work. And this lovely, gentle sponsor that I'd messaged just said, well, that's not how we do it. We don't use food plans. It's more about finding a willingness and setting aside all you think you know about yourself and recovery. Well, I was stunned. Not use food plans? That was the first I'd ever heard about that. And how could there be a different way to the way I had been trying? I mean, the way I'd been trying for 6 years, which clearly didn't work. I was so desperate. I started listening and learning. So first of all, I started listening to CCEA recordings and going to meetings. And I loved what I heard about the higher power. And I'd always known I needed a stronger connection to my higher power, but just had not known how to get it. At that time, I did have a morning routine of prayers and meditations, but then for the rest of the day, I was in control, or trying to be in control, having endless conversations in my head about how things needed to be, or talking in my head with people, rehearsing conversations, or kind of ranting in myself about the being angry with people, endless worrying and trying to figure things out. And although I wasn't overeating so much at that point, I was still wasting a huge amount of time just being inside my head. So anyway, I worked with this sponsor. I was completely baffled by the idea of not having a food plan or not to be thinking about trigger foods. But I just had to trust. I mean, I literally had nowhere else to go. So I was going to meetings, listening to recordings, hearing that this had worked for others, trusting it could work for me. So we worked through the steps quickly in a matter of a few weeks. And I had to swallow my pride, which said, oh, but I've done the steps so many times. Surely I don't need to do them again. But clearly I did. I had so much to learn. And as I'd said, I hadn't actually got through all the steps anyway. So the biggest thing to learn was about God. And I looked at my childhood experience of God, who was a man sitting on a cloud, disapproving of every single thing I did. So it wasn't surprising that I wasn't keen to bring him back into my life. However, I was desperate. Listening to the experience of others, it looked like I had no choice. I had to find a way of having God in my life. So one of those key passages in the big book in Bill's story, where Bill talks about his old prejudice, he says, the word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. And that resonated so much with me. It was exactly how I felt. But then he says, my friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And that was a huge revelation to me, my own conception of God. I'd never heard of such an idea. And it felt like that was a kind of a new starting point for me, that I could actually just start accepting something. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know where it was coming from or how it was going to help. But I just let myself. I remember being out in nature or just being out in my garden and just listening to birds and looking at trees and just something new coming into my mind, a difference from, the God of my childhood. So that's about a year ago. I have a different sponsor now. I love this program. One of the things I love is that when my first CCEA sponsor let me know that she couldn't sponsor me anymore for personal reasons, it was like, oh no, the same thing is happening. I'm too much for anyone. But in her message, she suggested I talk to her sponsor. So I did. And in fact, that sponsor took me on. And that was a huge eye-opener. This program being different to anything I've been involved in, this level of support, the knowledge that there is this line of sponsors that I can turn to. Not to say I do it very often, I find it very hard, but knowing they're there is very powerful. If I need to talk to my sponsor and she's not there, I can call her sponsor. If she's not there, I can call her sponsor. It's amazing. And when I do talk to my sponsor about something, about an amends or doing a step 10, I know that she might check in with her sponsor about it before getting back to me. I find that incredibly reassuring, the guidance that comes to us through many different channels. So I worked through the steps again, and everything just became, although I was doing it more quickly, things like my step 4 inventory was much more detailed. I was much more open to looking at myself than I had been before. It's taken me a long time to accept how many amends I need to do. I was very reluctant because I felt that as a pretty quiet person that I hadn't caused much harm. I'm not someone that speaks out or gets into arguments. If anything, I feel like I've been too quiet. But then it's that arrogance and superiority that's had to go. And the more I take an honest look at my life, the more I'm looking at, where I clearly have many amends to do and I'm working through them slowly. And my life now centers on this program. I'm learning more and more that it has to come first. And this has been hard for me. My sponsor has to continuously pull me along, and because I keep wanting to be in control, keep thinking that I know best. And so my program's very imperfect, but steps 10, 11, and 12 are how I live my life. I'm up at 6:30 and I spend time in prayer, reading the big book. I read that on awakening passages. I say specific prayers as necessary. If I need to pray for, a particular resentment prayer, I'll do that. Or if there's somebody, in my family or friends where I need to pray, I take that time. I use two-way prayer as well. And I look at where my mind is going and do the step 10s as necessary. I can wake up sometimes in the pits of despair in the morning, or something that's going round and round in my head. And I have to do that work, or it will run for my day. I take my to-do lists to God. I've always been one for lists and goals for today, for this week, for this month. And now, as I'm reminded every day in that On Awakening reading, it says, we consider our plans for the day. And I take my lists and I say, here you go, God, what shall I do with these? And I just have some quiet time with my planner and my diary in front of me. And it always changes something. Sometimes they get cut out completely. I realize that my to-do list is just a distraction from something that I really need to do. Or they will at least change and, become less. I do my step 10s through the day. I find it hard. I'm still learning to remember and praying for the willingness to keep doing it. But more and more it's coming and makes such a difference when I do. I really notice that when I do those prayers, when I hand over the character defects, when I see them happening, the changes that it makes in the moment is really incredible. My sponsor's constantly telling me to go back to the big book, go back to God. And I need that repetition because I was so skeptical that anyone or anything could actually help. Surely I just had to rely on myself. I do my nightly review my day. Where did I surrender? Where can I grow tomorrow? And I thank God for the miracles of today. I take action to do 12-step service, and that's been a big push for me. Feelings of inadequacy, fear of making mistakes, fear of getting criticized, perfectionism, etc. have all got in the way. And again, the gentle but persistent encouragement from my sponsor has been crucial. I sponsor. I love talking with newcomers and sharing the hope that I've found. I co-chair on the line-by-line meetings. I've only recently started sharing like this. This is my first time sharing in a meeting like this in a marathon. I'm doing my first foundation and line-by-line meeting next week, after which I hope to be able to take up a regular commitment to one of those meetings. This is huge for me. When I remember starting the steps and being told that you will need to sponsor, and just thinking, well, we'll see. I'm probably the one person that isn't able to sponsor or won't be able to, moderate a meeting and all that kind of stuff. It's funny what our minds does, isn't it? So what else is happening? I'm beginning to do wind-up work. I go to God for removal of the feelings of inadequacy. I'm beginning to draft a poster that I can put up in community spaces in my neighborhood. I love that idea, and I'm inspired when I hear others share about doing this. And I love to think of us carrying the message in our own little patches around the world. And what my life is like now, I'm in a relationship with a lovely man who I feel more deeply committed to as time goes on. It's making me cry, just think about it. That's an absolute miracle. It started just before I came into CCEA, but there's no way I'd still be in it if it wasn't for this program. I'd been single, I'd lived on my own for 30 years. When I left my husband, I kind of knew that I could not be with anyone. The noise in my head would make it impossible. So I hadn't even been looking for anyone. And then the universe sent me this man. And the program is totally influential in us being together and staying together. Being able to think of him as spiritually sick and a child of God, just like me, changes everything. I use the prayer on page 67, the sick man prayer, saying, X is spiritually sick, just like me. Help me think of him with kindness, tenderness, and love. Show me how to be helpful. And it just makes such a difference, even just in the moment. Some of his ways of behaving that used to drive me mad. Now I can laugh at myself and just let it go and focus on all the positives. Things just don't get to me so much. I used to be so sensitive to everything. I had pretty much an automatic no to almost anything he suggested, that only I could have ideas for what we should do or where we should go. Just, I just wanted to be the one in charge. I do the step 10s on my feelings that come up around him, and just really looking in detail at what's going on, taking some time to breathe, be quiet, sometimes just write, just journal. I find that the feelings can come out there, and it can be quite eye-opening on what my part is, what my character defects are, often making myself laugh when I realize how ridiculous I am. Like, I can be cross because he hasn't read my mind about something. He should know that I want a particular reply to my last text message. So what else? Looking over my health and relationship ideals, asking God to help me to be willing to work towards them. I wrote out my ideals with prompts from my sponsor, and I just look at them in quiet time in the morning. It takes a minute, but that can change the shape of my day. So as an example, it's a long distance relationship. We see each other every weekend. And we text each other a few times most days. And first thing in the morning, I might think, I'll text him good morning and see what he's up to. And then my mind will get in almost straight away and say, oh, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe that's me being needy. Maybe I should wait and see if he messages first. I wonder how long before he does. And then I'm doomed to all that crazy stuff, just, waiting for him to text. And it's just crazy. So I take a look at that sheet with my relationship ideals. It includes things like being giving and supportive, being open, being honest. And I just send the message. Whereas I would have been waiting for the return message pre-programmed, getting crosser. Now it's just not an issue. I have my own version of the sick man prayer. And many of my relationships have changed enormously because of that prayer. My sponsor reminded me recently of just saying, bless them, change me. I was having some really big difficulties with a family member who wasn't looking after my aunt in the way that I thought they should be. And I was just saying that as soon as that stuff came into my head, where I know I'm going to start going round and round and kind of having imaginary conversations with them about how they really should be looking after their mother and so on. And I would just stop myself and just bless them, change me, bless them, change me. And it would start to change. It just takes the noise out of my head. And then when I have a chance to sit down quietly and take a proper bit of time, I can get a bit more, kind of enlightened about what's going on and what, if anything, I need to do about the situation. So I'm gradually stopping trying to change other people's lives, realizing that's not my job anymore. I thought I had ways of making things better for them, when actually I knew nothing. It was just getting stressed myself, beginning to have a way of handing over. I've spent a long time, years, saying, I don't know how to hand over. I don't know what it means to let go. I don't get it. And slowly it's coming. The more I pray, the more I pause and breathe and trust. And I've noticed that my reactions are different now, where I used to have a very quick response to anything that I saw, even the slightest hint of a criticism, I would be on the defensive straight away. I notice that I pause before I speak now, especially in what might be a tricky situation, and I'm aware of the effect that my words and tone of voice might have on the other person. I notice that when I'm walking down the street now, I'm much more noticing, I'm smiling at people I see, I'm noticing nature, whereas I used to be in my head and I wouldn't even notice what I've just walked past. I don't have neutrality around food yet. My mind still wants to think in terms of triggers, of what I should avoid. It still wants rules. I love rules, but I'm growing and it's changing. It's really, really changing. And I'm asking God on a daily basis to guide me. I do know that I don't need to seek out ease and comfort like I used to because my mind isn't so messed up. And on many days, I have a calmness and serenity that I never thought possible. And it looks like I'm going to finish a bit early. I'm going to read a favourite bit in the big book. This is page 275. So AA is not a plan for recovery that can be finished and done with. It is a way of life. And the challenge contained in its principles is great enough to keep any human being striving for as long as he lives. We cannot outgrow this plan. As arrested alcoholics, we must have a program for living that allows for limitless expansion. Keeping one foot in front of the other is essential for maintaining our arrestment. Others may idle in a retrogressive groove without too much danger, but retrogression can spell death for us. However, this isn't as rough as it sounds, as we do become grateful for the necessity that makes us toe the line, and we find that we are compensated for a consistent effort by the countless dividends that we receive. A complete change takes place in our approach to life. Where we used to run from responsibility, we find ourselves accepting it with gratitude that we can successfully shoulder it. Instead of wanting to escape some perplexing problem, we experience the thrill of challenge in the opportunity it affords for another application of AA techniques, and we find ourselves tackling it with surprising vigor. The last 15 years of my life have been rich and meaningful. I have had my share of problems, heartaches and disappointments, because that is life. But also I have known a great deal of joy and a peace that is the handmaiden of an inner freedom. I have a wealth of friends, and with my AA friends an unusual quality of fellowship. For to these people I am truly related, first through mutual pain and despair, and later through mutual objectives and newfound faith and hope. And as the years go by, working together, sharing our experiences with one another, and also sharing a mutual trust, understanding and love without strings, without obligation, we acquire relationships that are unique and priceless. There is no more aloneness with that awful ache so deep in the heart of every alcoholic that nothing before could ever reach it. That ache is gone and never need return again. Now there is a sense of belonging, of being wanted and needed and loved. In return for a bottle and a hangover, we have been given the keys. We have been given the keys of the kingdom.